We have something rather remarkable happening in the readings today in the gospel. Two women are conversing. As you know, Luke pays far more attention to women than the other gospel writers and the other writers of the Bible in general. But in this case, he does something rather unique. He has two women actually having a conversation, not somebody recounting a conversation between two women, but two women talking, two cousins, both pregnant. It's a fascinating meeting just in that alone. But then we have the speech of Elizabeth, which turns into a famous prayer that starts, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you." And then we have Mary's response. Now encoded, it is so important in liturgical literature and in prayer and in song around the world that we call it the Magnificat, which means in Latin, my soul magnifies, or my soul praises the Lord, because she starts with, my soul magnifies the Lord, my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. And what she says is unique about this. What she's praising God for is that God has shown favor to her, a lowly servant, a relatively insignificant person. In her eyes, a normal 13-year-old, 12, 13, 14, somewhere around there, betrothed and yet not married yet. And does she consider it a disaster that she's a single mother? No. She recognizes that it's a gift. And even just as interesting, Elizabeth knows it too. Before Mary has announced anything to her, Elizabeth knows. The other thing that's interesting about this is that Mary suddenly appears. You know, they didn't have cell phones then, or even telegrams or letters. You just showed up when you were visiting somebody. You just showed up, and they took you in. And so Mary appears to her, one peasant woman to another peasant woman. The words of her prayer, the words of the Magnificat, are considered revolutionary, subversive, that they upend the world. She says, God has lifted up the lowly and filled them with good things, and God has cast down the mighty, cast down the proud in the thoughts of their hearts, sent the rich away. That God is somehow upending the world through the arrival of Jesus Christ. I somewhat doubt, however, that when we talk about it as revolutionary, that people mean to actually foment armed military revolutions throughout the world, although those things happen. But rather a revolution in which we recognize that God is focusing on the peasants, the ordinary people, to bring the good news to those who have become distorted by power or wealth. And the reason that I doubt that she means to foment actual physical revolution is that there have been other appearances of Mary throughout history in which it's often during a time of war, and she is telling people to pray for peace and to pray for really the end of sin that brings about war. There are 5 appearances of Mary that I know of that are spoken a little bit, 3 that are official things approved by the Catholic Church with lots of research and doubt and so on, and then a couple others that have been reported. The first one in history was at Guadalupe, when she appeared to Juan Diego, a Native American and indigenous person who had converted to Christianity due to the Spanish colonialists there. And he had a vision of Mary, and he was a poor man. So when he went to the bishop and told the bishop about the visit from Mary, because that's what Mary told him to do, the bishop was dubious. Really, would she talk to you? Lots of research later, they decided that due to various miracles that happened, yes, it indeed was Mary. The second one that's spoken of famously is the appearance to a little girl named Bernadette in Lourdes, France. A child. And there were a series of visions. Told her mother said, "You're lying," told the priest said, "You're lying," told the bishop said, "You're lying." And yet the appearances just kept happening. And like with Juan Diego, the lady who appears at Lourdes tells them, 1, to pray for sinners, and 2, to build a chapel. Because Mary always says, build a chapel and pray for sinners, interestingly. That was in the 1800s. And then in 1917, in the midst of World War I, which was already ravaging Europe, she appears to 3 peasant children in Fatima, Portugal. 3 children, Lucia, Jacinta, and Francisco. And she tells them they need to pray a lot. They need to pray the rosary a lot. They need to get other people to pray. She asks them to build a chapel. She says, this war is going to end, and there is going to be a war much worse than this one later. She tells them, I'm not going to end your suffering in this world, but your suffering will end in the next world. The 2 other sightings that are documented that I know of are, one is in Khartoum, Egypt in 1968, a figure that keeps appearing on the top of a Coptic church. And they had the police and scientists and religious officials try to explain it some other way. Could it be projected from somewhere? Couldn't find an explanation, so they said, okay, it's a sighting of Mary. And then to 2 young girls in Rwanda before the war, and she told them there's going to be a war, and I cannot end your suffering in this life, but I can end your suffering in the next. That one is not as well documented because those 2 girls died in the Rwandan conflict, so it wasn't researched very well. But notice the pattern, appearing to relatively poor children, asking them to pray, asking them to build a chapel, warning them of war to come, and urging them to pray for sinners in particular. She doesn't come saying, everything is lovely, God bless you, you are all magically healed, although healings have happened at some of those sites. No, she says, pray, and there will be suffering. But think about who Mary is in our history. Mary suffered in childbirth, as all women do, and then she suffered at the death of her son because she had to watch it, the slow, painful death. This is often called the Lady of Sorrows. She knows sorrow well. So perhaps that's no surprise. Now, I went to one of these famous pilgrimage sites with our pilgrimage group from St. John's and others from the diocese who did the Camino Português to Santiago de Compostela. We started, however, at Fatima, which is a famous pilgrimage site. It was a little poor village in Portugal, also being affected by World War I. And that's surrounded by olive groves, and they would send sheep out to graze among the olive groves. Those were the 2 main ways they survived in this little village, olives and sheep. And as these 3 children were out, a lady appears and tells them to pray a lot, pray a lot, pray a lot, pray for sinners, and come back every month, I think, at this time, on this date. And the children tell their parents, and the parents are up in arms saying, you're lying. The priest says, I think you're imagining or lying. The local official says, you're imagining or lying. Now, one of the reasons that it was controversial at this time is that Portugal has been through a variety of political upheavals, communist, socialist, democratic, communist, socialist, democratic, communist, socialist. It's just switched hands every few years. And so as communism was moving across Europe, Christianity was trying to revive itself as a response to communism, at least the totalitarian nature of communism. That was where she came, and there is probably the most documentation about this site because this went on for months, months after months, and so people would come out to when the sightings were happening. They didn't see her, they didn't hear her. The children saw her, and 2 of the children heard her each time. And if she said it was okay, they would report what was being said. People would beg them to pray for healings for their loved ones. Sometimes they would happen, sometimes they would not. And then she finally said, the lady said, I will perform a miracle on such and such a date. And on that date, 70,000 people came to this huge field. If you saw the field, there's nothing remarkable about it. It's like a little garden near a California mission. It's that big. It's really not that big an area. 70,000 people, and saw a bright light come down from the sky in the midst of a rainstorm. And there are photographs of it. So you can believe or not believe, but what is true is that a lot of people's faith lives have been transformed by these stories, because all of our faith is transmitted by stories. Now, when you ask members of our pilgrimage group, what was the most meaningful moment, I have yet to hear a single person say, oh, it was when I made those final steps after 100 miles at Santiago de Compostela. Not a single person has said that to me yet. A lot of people have said it was the candlelight procession in Fatima. Now, when you go into Fatima, it looks like a bunch of hotels for pilgrims, a huge plaza where there's an older basilica that looks very traditional, and then a very modernistic-looking basilica, and then a little chapel with an ancient little chapel that's only for one person. That was the one built in 1918 or so, after Mary told the children to build a chapel. And that's filled with people who are processing with candles. Now, interestingly, my cool moment in Fatima wasn't at the candlelight procession. My cool moment was when we just went to the little olive grove where they've set up stations of the cross, as we call them. You see them on our walls here. You commemorate moments of Jesus' passion as he walks toward the cross. And there were a variety of people from around the world. I heard French, I heard Spanish, I heard Italian. And there was our troop doing our little liturgy that we had prepared. And one of the guides said, now you're probably going to see people doing things like kneeling or praying the rosary or stuff like that, things we're not going to be doing. And I pulled out my rosary and I said, well, I have my rosary. And then another woman said, I have my rosary. And then another woman, it was her turn to read our little liturgy thing for that station. And she said, I brought my mother's rosary. So we're all holding them up like, we've got ours. Because why not? We're just saying the words of Elizabeth. And the reason it was powerful to me is because it was so ordinary. Olive trees are all over California. I've grown up with them. They're common. The little village where she grew up is very common. And I went to the house where she grew up, and it is still just a little house with a little kind of a fold on the side that almost looks like an outdoor garage where they kept their few sheep. And there's no sign on it that says, this is Lucia's house, she's the famous one. There are no T-shirts saying, Mary was sighted here. I mean, I think you can get those somewhere in Fatima, but it wasn't in your face. It's just a regular place. And yet, at that regular place that still looks like a regular place, people are completely transformed by the fact that it happened there. Mary is incredibly ordinary and appears to ordinary people, and especially children and teenagers. Now, why would that be? Why would that be? Because they are willing to open themselves up to God in ways that adults may have closed themselves off to. They are still available to wonder. They are still available to the extraordinary news that Jesus is going to be born to a 13-year-old in the middle of nowhere. Because children are closer in some ways to God. They are light bearers. They are Christ bearers. And we are getting ready for Jesus to be born again. Will we be the Christ bearers in our time? Will we?